All right, so today is a lot of information. There's a lot of information in this last day. This is components 2. We're going to still be looking at components, but we're going to be using components in a way that's a lot more like you're going to be doing in the real world as a developer. So this will be some of you all, this will be the first time you see a bunch of these things. So asynchronous code is something we're going to be looking at, and promises. We're going to be looking at making requests to get data from a server. So it's the first time some of you will be working with APIs. We're also going to, again, iterate over a list of data, but this time it's going to be a list of data that's coming from the API instead of just some data that we have put into the project like we did yesterday. So there's a lot to cover. The first part of this lecture is going to be me talking about asynchronous code, talking about promises a little, talking about APIs. I did send out the lecture notes this time. I didn't put the solution in for right now, but I will afterwards, just because there's a lot of information and there's a lot of links. And this way, if you want to follow along in the notes, you can. So it will be a little easier for a lot of people. All right, so to get started, we're going to talk about synchronous versus asynchronous code. So for right now, your understanding of JavaScript should be that it is synchronous code. Can you tell me in a thread here? We want a thread. So first off, what is synchronous? I'm going to always spell that wrong. Synchronous code. Not asynchronous. What is synchronous code? What should JavaScript be doing? What do we know of JavaScript and what should it be doing? Exactly, great. One thing at a time. The code executes line by line, top to bottom. It happens line by line. If you're not sure, that's great. Thank you for putting that single file line one at a time. So if you think of like a road with cars on it, everyone's just going along on the road with their cars. Everyone's just going. If for some reason a car stopped and you had a traffic jam, everyone has to wait. And the same thing happens with synchronous code with JavaScript. If you have something that's going and taking a long time, like maybe a for loop that is going through a really, really big number, all of your data, all of your lines of code are now backed up and having to wait. So yes, great. Line by line, one thing at a time. That is what we're used to with JavaScript. That did not work well with more modern applications, because nowadays we are working with APIs. We're grabbing data from something. We are creating code that is waiting for something, and then it executes. And so we had to have a way to deal with asynchronous code. So synchronous code is line by line. So all of your code that you put in, JavaScript knows that it's supposed to go read that line, execute it, read that line, execute it, read that line, execute it. And like I just said, if there was something blocking it, it would wait, and all the code beneath would then have to wait as well. But this is where we introduce asynchronous code. So one way that people talk about asynchronous code a lot, if you are looking at the notes at all, you can click on this or you can just watch me do it. This is a visualization of asynchronous code. So normally when you're going through, JavaScript would go line by line by line, and things would go on what's called the call stack. So your information would go here, it would execute, and then it would pop off. That's where you get push and pop, if you heard those before. Things are getting pushed onto the call stack, and then it's getting popped off. Pushed on, popped off. When you bring in something and set timeout, if you don't know what that is, it's okay. It's just simulating asynchronous code for us. It's doing something where we have to wait. And we'll see that when we're going through the set timeout, the stuff that has set timeout is going to go over to something called the web APIs. It's going off our call stack. It's no longer a part of the normal JavaScript. It's going off of that and it's waiting. Then it's going to go through a callback queue where it waits until everything else in the call stack is done executing. It's going to go through what's called an event loop and go back up to the call stack and execute. We're going to see this happening with set timeout, but it's so that we can visualize what happens when we make a call to data. So I'm going to run it right now. It goes a little bit fast, so we'll probably run it like 2 or 3 times. So our set timeouts over here, our other stuff is going through, our other set timeout is over here, and it's waiting. It's going to the call stack, and then everything gets done. One important thing to note about asynchronous code is that if it's over and it's waiting, if you've done an asynchronous code, if you've done some kind of call to an API, it cannot come back on the call stack until everything else has that is here, the other code, so these console.logs have executed. They have to execute first, and then your stuff goes back onto the call stack. So I'm going to try to run that again. Sometimes this thing's a little glitchy. Yeah, so sometimes this thing's glitchy if you use it more than once. This is just something a developer created because he was explaining it. But I also have another visualization here we can talk about. So this would be, we're going to start the code, and what we're going to see is we're going to see some console.logs, and we're going to see what should be a data request. And we'll see that the data request goes off, and the console.logs still execute. And the data request waits until they're all done, and then it executes. So we got a console.log, data request, and then the console.logs are going, and then the data is fetched. So once again, these are all in the notes. If you want to go back and visualize them later on, they're in here. So before I get too farther and bring up even more words that maybe you're not familiar with, let me know right now any vocabulary we're talking about that maybe you're unfamiliar with or you want to go over again. So any questions so far? Make sure I'm in the right channel. Yes. Okay. Thumbs up. You're okay so far. Or if you have questions, give me questions. All right, there was one in Slido. What does pop off mean? So we have push and pop in JavaScript. So when something gets pushed onto the call stack, that's where you saw like these were all running. The console.log got pushed onto the call stack. After it executes, so it console.logs high in this case, then it gets popped off the call stack. So you push something onto what's called the call stack where you're waiting to execute your code. So that's where the code gets executed. And then you are popping it off when it's done. So Denise, let me know if that answered that for you. Okay, what is an API? That's okay. Don't be embarrassed if you don't know what an API is. I actually put this whole section in the notes because APIs are confusing. Most people don't know what it is the first time. So let's go down. I think it's down a little bit. Here we go. What is an API? So an API, application programming interface. Nowadays, when we're working, we're usually talking about a web-based API when we're talking about APIs. And what an API does is it returns data from a response that we've made by the client. So when we request some data, the API returns something. But in more basic terms, an API just allows applications, whatever you're working with, like your application, to communicate with one another. So we will be building an application that's going to communicate with a dog API. that API is just giving us some information. That's our project today. We'll be working with a dog API, and the API just allows us to communicate with it and get some information from it. So that when you're like building an application, if you had to have a whole bunch of data, you saw yesterday just that little bit of data that we did to go through, you would have to fill that whole thing out. Just think of all the users you might have on an application, all kinds of things. Normally, you're going to be dealing with an API, some kind of database, some kind of information that you can communicate with and get that information back. So that is what an API is in the sense of like a web-based API. It is an application programming interface that we can communicate with and get some kind of information back. So a more practical, yeah, we're going to get into the practical, Russ. So the whole point initially is to talk about it and then show you. So the whole project today is all about step-by-step working with an API. So when stuff in callback queue is waiting for call stack to empty, how far down in lines of code will it wait? So that is kind of tricky. You don't actually always know when it's going to come back in. That can be the kind of the tricky thing with asynchronous code. Typically, it needs to wait until everything has come off the call stack. But if you think about applications that are really, really big, it may inject itself in at some other point. So that can be a tricky thing with asynchronous code. All right. So like I said before, we are going to be talking about a lot of information first because many of you all don't even know what these terms are. So we have to talk about them first, and then we are going to use them in the project. All right. So some of you already, hopefully all of you, but at least some of you went through the TK and you saw promises. And promises are what we use to handle asynchronous functions. So normally, like I said, we're going to have just a synchronous code one after the other, and you would have what's called blocking code that is blocking your other code from executing. So nothing on that call stack could go if you had something blocking it. And with promises, which are special objects built into JavaScript that get returned immediately when we make a call to the web browser API. With those, we don't have to wait for our other code to execute. Like our other code can execute and we don't have to wait. If you think of like grabbing data from something, that takes a little bit of time. You're making a request to something and you have to wait for that data to come back and then do something with it. So our other code can still execute, but our async code, our data calls can wait and then execute when the call stack is empty. So promises just act as a placeholder for the data we hope to get back. And we're going to see that in just a second. And then we attach some functionality to it after we get something back. Some of you saw in the TK the promises when they were created. Most of the time you're going to be dealing with what's called consuming promises. So after that data is returned, that's when you're going to be dealing with the promise. You're not going to be creating your own promises. So that's where we're going to use this dot then and dot catch methods that we're going to see in just a minute. All right, let's go ahead, and I think the only other thing we need to talk about before we get started is the dog API and Axios. I don't want to jump into the project until you at least see them. So again, there's links here. What we're going to be working with is this dog API, where you can either get random images of dogs or you can get select breed images of dogs. There is a breeds list right here, in case you don't have the notes open. All right. And we're going to be making a call, a data call, to our API using a URL like this. So you're going to see when we're using Axios, we're going to be able to make a call, a request to this API, and we're going to get some data back. And the last thing you'll want to know just where it is, we're going to be going through Axios and I'm going to show you how to use it. But if you want to do more with Axios or you get confused in the afternoon project today, just know that the Axios documentation is here in the links. And that is where you want to go if you're having questions about Axios later on and you need to know how to use it, okay? So we do have a link to the Axios documentation. All right, so our guided project right now is just empty. We don't have anything in here yet. What we want to get to is this point where we're going to create a component like we did yesterday. This is going to be a little card component. And then we want to be able to fetch some data from that API and fill in our data with the requests that we get from the API. In this case, I requested the Mastiff. That was the breed that I requested. You can put another breed in when we're playing with it. So that is the goal for right now. So gonna all right, so we have a step 1 here. We're gonna inspect the HTML, and just like yesterday, we can see there's not really anything in here. So there's nothing here, but we're going to append the component that we create to this right here, this entry point at after we're done creating it. All right, step 2, you can look through the CSS if you'd like. I'm just using Flexbox for this. In the past I had used Grid, and then I realized many of you hadn't used CSS Grid yet. So it's been changed to Flexbox, so you can go through that code at the end if you want to. All right. So now we're gonna first make a request because we want to see what the data looks like. Data that you get from an API looks different depending on what kind of API you're making a request to. So before we can even create cards, we want to see what kind of data are we getting back from this. So this is where we're going to set up Axios. You need to make sure you have Axios. So we don't yet in here. So in the pin settings, if you go up to settings, and down here where you have external scripts, you want to put in Axios, like that. And then that just adds the script in like you would normally in your JavaScript. Make sure I don't have it anywhere else. I know they used to have it in here. Okay. So now we should be able to use Axios. It's a library that we can use to handle promises. Okay, so now I'm going to go through and show you how to set up an Axios call. So the first thing you do is you do Axios, and then we're gonna do a get method. So does anyone know what like get, put, delete, does anyone know what those are? There's another one in there. Yep, okay, Eric's already told us, so we're good. They are HTTP methods. They are methods to either get data from something or you can put data. So again, I put this in the notes. There is a visual of this. HTTP methods and their meanings. We're gonna be working with a GET request. At the end of the time you're with me, we're gonna do a POST request. You won't get to put or delete until you're further along in Lambda. But we're going to be doing a GET request for the next 2 weeks at least, is what we're going to be working with. And what that does is it gets data from the API that we can read. So we can read the data. So I'm going to do axios.get. And then here you put where you want to get the information. So for me, I'm doing this random images of mastiffs that you can put in, or you can pick a different breed if you want a different breed. So I'm getting information from the API, 12 random images. And then the other part of this promise that we're dealing with is a dot then and a dot catch. So the dot then does something with that information, and the dot catch catches if there's errors. So I'm going to do dot then, and we put in response. This is kind of one of those like boilerplate things that you're going to be like, why are you putting response? That's how they handle it. Sometimes you'll see it response like this, or you'll see res like that. So we want the response. And then the first thing you do anytime you get information is you should just console.log the response that you're getting back so that you can see what the data looks like. I'm going to console.log response. Okay. All right. So if you try to look at it in this console, it's going to be too big. So we're going to have to go in and actually inspect here. We're going to see we get back this object. And inside here, this is like just the configuration. It's telling you the URL we made the request to. It's telling you the method we used, get method. You're probably not going to deal with this config that much the next few weeks. What you want is actually the data here. So we're going to go into our response and then into our data. So response.data, and then inside the data is the message that we want. So this isn't always going to look the same depending on the API you work with, but the majority of the time you're going to go in and you're going to see some kind of data or something that has the information you want. So we have our data, and it is an array of 12 images, so just 12 random images. This is similar to yesterday. This is just coming from an API. Yesterday we went into the data that we had, and we were able to get the title and the content. Today we're going to go into this data that we grabbed from the API, and we're going to get these images. All right, so what you do now, now that we have the response, we're actually going to wait because we need to set up a card before we can do anything with it. But we've hit a break time. So I'm going to set a time for a break, and then you give me any questions that we can answer when we come back. So any questions so far? All right, we got a couple of good questions in Slido, so I'm going to get those up real quick. All right, so you can make promises with vanilla JavaScript, but making them with Axios is just easier, right? We're actually not making the promises, we're consuming them. So it is a little bit different. It's a little bit confusing. TK does go through it some on like the difference between that. But basically, Axios is just a nice way to deal with requests that you get back from an API. Axios doesn't, you don't have to do something called JSON stringify. So we're dealing with JSON information. If you were to go to actually look at some of this, let's see where the code is, documentation. This is all JSON that we're dealing with. And normally, if you use, and this kind of goes on one of the other questions in here, if you use like the fetch method that is in JavaScript, then you have to also do like javascript.stringify and a couple of other things. Axios just makes it easier to deal with the information that you're getting back from the API. Denise, I'm not sure if I have that anymore. If I do have it, I'll share it. So just asking if I'd share the grid example as well. If I still have it, I'll share it. I have lots of other examples with grid. So what exactly is an application? What's the difference between a web page and an application? You're probably going to hear these used similar often. A web page in general, just kind of general difference about them. A web page is probably going to use, I think I saw a good visual. Yeah, here we go. So like a website typically just has like HTML, your CSS, your JavaScript, and maybe some other like backend like WordPress. These other things, Drupal, Joomla, Magneto, are pretty much the same as WordPress. They're just other CMSs. Whereas a web application, also going to have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but probably have some other kind of more complex backend to them. There's more to it. I can send out a link a little later on like the difference between them. But usually a web application is much more substantial, whereas a website is something that's going to be easier for individuals to deal with and upkeep, whereas a web application, you're probably going to have several people working on it. So even when I've been saying like web application, it's probably not exactly the correct term to be using there, more like a website, but we're making apps. So that's why I'm saying web application. Okay, yes, I'll go through turning on Axios again. So we can do that in just a second. We got that one. So the other way to handle promises that is native to vanilla JavaScript, besides Axios, is a fetch method, which we don't go through. I'm not sure if Dustin does. I think at some point you all will see just fetch, which is just a native way to handle. Same thing as Axios, but Axios is a library that we're using. It's just a JavaScript library that makes it easier to handle working with promises. Okay, going back here. So what I did to get Axios, normally, and we might want to see it in the Axios documentation, normally you would put in like a script, or you would do yarn add Axios, or you would add that CDN script here. When you're working in CodePen, you don't have to do this. You don't have to do these little scripts. You can just go in here to your settings, to the JavaScript setting, and then you can find, this is just essentially finding the script, the CDN script that you would normally put in. So I just put in Axios like that, and I was able to find the script. So even here it says it's a promise-based HTTP client for the browser, and it's just a way for us to deal with the information we're getting. Okay. Just going through some of the comments I have here. All right. So now what we want to do, before we actually set this up the rest of the way, we still have to set up our Axios call to show our information, but we want to get a function going, a functional component going first, so that we have somewhere to put this information. So step 4 is to build out a basic dog card component. We should only concern ourselves with displaying the image at this point, is what it's saying. So we're going to try to work on that right now. So the same as yesterday, we're just going to set up a functional component. So function, I'm going to call this dog card. You could do dog card if you like that better. I'm just kind of getting in the habit of like React here. So a lot of times with React, all your stuff is uppercase like this. So I'm going to pass in a parameter. Our parameter is going to be that data that we're getting back. So I'm putting an image URL because that's the data we're getting back. Okay, and then I want my cards. So let's look at them here because we don't have a template. So we can see just what I did here. We're going to have a container, and then we're going to have an image, and then we're going to have, for me, I called it an H3. So we need to have an H3, some kind of container, and then an image as well that we create. So I'm going to do const new card equals document dot create element, and this is going to be a div. In case you didn't know, I imagine some of you knew, but if you don't, you can just put a comma here and then do your next variable. You don't have to put const every single time if you're putting a comma here instead of putting a semicolon. So I'm just going to put our next one is going to be new image. So this is just creating another variable. Oh, not event, element. And this is going to be our image. And then we're going to do a breed as well. All right, so we've set up our div, our image, and our H3. Now we need to add some content and also if we have any classes, which I do have a few classes. I'm gonna have to tell you since we don't have a template for this. So I'll just tell you what the classes are as we set it up. So first I'm gonna do our breed here had some text content. It was saying what the breed was. So I'm gonna do breed.text content equals, and then it was our breed. And if you want a different dog that you grab, you can put a different breed here, and then you just need to put a different breed right here. So if you don't want to see the Mastiff, just put a different breed here and put one here. There's a way to dynamically do this in JavaScript as well, which we'll see later on. Next week, I think, on how to do that dynamically. We'll kind of come back to this dog API at some point, but for now, we're just going to hard code it. Okay, and then we have our image here. So new image dot source, and we want to set the source to our parameter here. So our image URL is what I'm setting it to. Right. And then we have a few class names. So our image had a class name. If we go in here, we can see we have a dog image class name. And then I also have a dog card class name that we need to add as well. So new image. And I'm going to put in our dog image. All right. And then the card has a class name. All right. So now at this point, we have our text, we have some sources. I did this part right here wrong. And then we also, so we have our source, some text, some classes that we've added on, and we've created our elements. So what is the next step that we need to do when we're creating a function here? I like that one. Append the kids. Yes, we got to append the child. Append. Okay, so in this case, what will we be appending? What needs to be appended? And where is it going to be appended to? Thank you, Matthew, for catching the typo. I'll fix that. Yeah, so anytime you do live coding, you're probably going to have lots of spelling errors. It just happens. So thank you for catching them. Thanks, Matthew. So what should we append to? What do we need to append to? Oh, some of you already put it in here. Okay, so we're going to append it to the card and the card to entry. So append to new card. Great, thank you for those who put it in. Yep, pretty much. You will see all of us instructors from here on out making spelling errors. It just happens when you're live coding. So, okay, new card dot append child, and we're going to append the new image. And then we are also going to append the breed. So new card dot append child breed. All right, and before I forget, what's the thing you need to do when you're creating a functional component? Like right now, I haven't done it yet, so if I tried to like loop through this or something, it wouldn't work. So what am I missing right now? Return, yes. I don't know how many times I've gone through and done green sock animations and just frustrated that they weren't working, and then realizing I hadn't returned my functions that I was creating, and that's why it wouldn't work. So definitely try to make sure you return things. So we're going to return our new card because that's what we're going to be appending to our entry out there. So returning the new card, that's the parent here. And then later on, we might add some functionality, but right now, this is the main thing right here. So right here with this card, we'll be able to loop through it, and we'll be able to put out some information. So we can go back to step 3 to do that. But before I do that, let's go ahead and take any questions. Oh, typing as I'm talking. Any questions? If you don't have questions, give me a thumbs up, okay? How would you activate Axios and VS Code? Depending on what you're doing, you would, I imagine today you're going to be doing a script, so you would be adding the script that I mentioned that is on the Axios website, the CDN. You would be putting that into your JavaScript script. Sometimes you're going to install modules with Yarn or npm install, depending on the kind of work environment you're doing. You're going to be doing a lot more Yarn and npm install when you're getting into React. You said we're not creating the promise, so where's the promise in the situation? Is it created by the API? So going back to like promises and talking about promises a little. Here we go. So promises, they're something that immediately, it gets returned immediately when we make a call to the web browser API. So that is why we're getting it and we can consume it, because we're making a call and it is immediately returned to us from the call to the web browser API. Oops, my code pin should be saved. So for whoever just asked about that, it automatically saves. Okay, why use append child versus append? Preference, it doesn't really matter which one you want to use. There are slight differences. One is a DOM method and one is a JavaScript function. So append child's a DOM method and append is a JavaScript function. And there's different use cases where you might use one or the other. I've just been sticking with append child, but you can use append if you want to. The dog CDN, it's not a CDN, so it is a URL that you're going to call to depending on what you're trying to get. So you don't need a CDN for the dog API. It's not a CDN. When you're making a call to a API, you're going to make a call to some kind of URL that the API provides for you, and every API is different. So that's definitely something you need to check every single time. But if you want the Axios, like Robert put here, this is the CDN for that. Does the order matter when you do text content, then class list, then append child? But yesterday it was the other way around. No, and I mentioned this yesterday. It doesn't matter the order. You can do whatever you want in that case. Yesterday I just had it kind of all lined up in a certain way so that it was easily readable. Today we're just doing it a little bit different, but it does not matter the order that you're doing it in. All right, so once again, we have made a response or made a GET request to an API. So this dog API gave us these different URLs that we could hit. Sometimes you can put these into, so if you are making a request, this is what was in our console when I looked at it. Sometimes you can just put them into your URL and you'll get that JSON that you can look at. So we got like a message, and this one is just a whole list. So this is a list, it doesn't necessarily have the images. What we did was we did this URL, which again, you could put into a URL to see. And what we got back was some data, and inside the data there was a message that had all of the URLs that we're going to be using for our cards. All right. So the first thing we need to do is we need to not just get the response. Right now we have response. If you were to do response dot data, so you remember we saw there was a data, and then you did dot message like this. This one will probably pop up in the console because it's not so big. Yeah. We were able to go into that JSON object there, and we were able to go into the data and then into the message, and the message is giving us back these images. So that is what we want to work with. We want to work with response.data.message because that's our image source that we want. So I'm going to do response dot data dot message. Let me clear this and get rid of this for right now. And then I'm going to use a for each for this. Some of you saw yesterday you could do a map too. I'm going to do a for each. And then I'm just putting item here. Okay. And then I'm going to set this up as const new dog equals dog card and passing in our item. And then I'm doing, oops, that's not what I want. Our entry point. Oh, I got to grab that first. So that would be something we need to grab. I haven't grabbed yet, but we'll grab that in just a second. So our entry point is the entry div, and we still need to grab it. I haven't grabbed it yet with our query selector. So I'm going to do entry point dot append child, and I'm going to put in new dog here. All right, so nothing's going to show up because like I just said, I haven't actually defined what entry point is. I saw this a couple times in the help channel yesterday, so just to make sure before you're trying to append something that you're actually grabbing what you want to append to. So we need to go up and we need to do entry point here. So const entry point equals document dot query selector entry. All right. So let's go through the code of what just happened, since that was a quick like, whoa, everything just popped up. What we did was we created a reusable functional component like we did yesterday. We returned the new card, which is this like main parent that we had appended everything else to. And then we got our entry point here. So const entry point equals document.query selector entry, which was, doesn't want to slide down. Okay. Which was up there in our HTML. And then we also made a GET request to a URL. We got a response back. And from that response, we were able to loop through the information, which is the URL, essentially, the URL here. And we put that item, the URLs that we were getting, inside as our parameter. So our parameter. And then we appended it to our entry point. So this right here, this item, what it's doing is it's looping through all the information that we got back from the API, which was just those URLs. So that was the information we got back. It's just a bunch of URLs. And then I'm using that as my parameter right here, which we set up to be the source. So our parameter is image URL, that's going to be our source. And that is why we have these images showing up now. These adorable little dogs. All right, so we have hit another time for a break. So I'm going to leave my code up during the break this time, but I need to get the timer tab going, so I will bring it back up so people can see it. And then if you have questions, go ahead and get them into Slido. So. All right, so a couple of questions here. And if you have more, you can put them into Slido. I'm kind of asking or answering questions right now. What happens if you put the Axios call to get data inside dog card? Will that still work and save the data into the variable? So again, these kinds of questions, while I think it's fine and we can do it together, feel free to experiment with it. Like try it. I mean, try putting the Axios call into dog card and see what happens. What's the worst that can happen? It just doesn't get the Axios call. So we can try this together, but definitely don't be afraid to try these things out with your code. This is the time to be experimenting and figuring it out, but let's try. I'm not understanding why you're writing image URL gets the images you want. Where is it being given those images? So yes, we'll go over that in just a second. Can you explain where you get response.data.message.for each from? I don't really understand the data.message. Yes, we'll go over the request again. And I think because we're going to have some extra time, a nice thing that we can do in a little bit is we can pick, if you all go through these awesome list of APIs here, these are public APIs. We can look at grabbing more data from an API with Axios calls because that might be helpful to see what this data is and where it's coming from. Okay, is data.message on line 22 Axios syntax? No, this is coming from what we got from our response. So I'm going to go through that one again. There's enough of you asking that we will go through what exactly this response is and what we're getting. So. Line 16, I'll try to look at. So I'm a little confused on how you pass the Axios data dog images to the parameter. Yes, we'll look at that. So most of all, it seems like we don't understand where this logic's coming from. Like where's the dog images kind of stuff coming from? So let me go through that before we get to other questions. Okay. When you make a request to an API, whether it be the dog API, or I could make a request to something else like we're going to be using Studio Ghibli next week. This is also an API that I could make a request to. Base URL, let's see. Which one do I want? We'll just get one. That's not what I want. The films. I think I have to put films in there, but we can look at that in a second. Anytime you make a request to an API, it gives you back a response. That's what we got here. We have our response. And initially, all I did, instead of doing this, initially I console.logged the response. So even taking out this .data.message, you have to look at the response first. You want to see what the response is that you get back. This was really long, so we couldn't look at it there. But the response was an object that had data. So we went into object and then into data. So just like yesterday, going to my notes here, where we had our, where we had some data. Oops, that's the breakout. Either way, we have some data. So pretend like this is an Axios call, and this is the data I'm getting back. This would be like, right here would be like getting my data and then going in and getting a message, and then that message has something, which is the URL. So same thing, we're just making a call for some data outside of like just putting in some hard-coded data. We're just getting some data that's already been pre-filled in for us. So here we have our response, and then it would be response.data, and inside the data that we open up, there's a message. So response.data.message is where we get our information. This information is a bunch of URLs. It's just, once we got our response.data.message, it's just a bunch of URLs. So when I went to here where I did response.data.message, that's synonymous with those URLs. That response.data.message is now that array of URLs, and we are looping through those URLs and giving them to the dog card as the parameter. So instead of it being this image URL, that's just a parameter. We could call that whatever we wanted, just an argument that we passed into the function, and we set it as our source. So it would be like setting the source to the actual URLs that we're getting back from the message, but it is an array. It's an array of URLs, so we are looping through it with our for each here, and then we are assigning each of those URLs to our dog cards here. So we're looping through each of the dog cards and giving them that information. So that is where we got the response.data.message from. It comes from the API call. I'm gonna get rid of that and save. So if I had put something else in here, like I don't remember some of the other ones they have. I think they have pug. My response now would be 12 random pug images. So those URLs would just be 12 random pug URLs, so images to the pug URLs here, and that is what I'm looping through and adding to the dog card. So I'm going to clear out those questions, and if you still have questions about it, so let me look at line 16 real quick. All right, so I'll go through this one because that was a question. All right. So line 16 was us getting that entry point, that entry of where we wanted to spit out all of our cards like we did yesterday. So yesterday we had some cards here. This was the breakout, but same thing. We had a section in the HTML called container, and after we created our reusable function, we appended it to the container div here. So that is what I'm doing here as well. We have a div, and I don't know why this won't move. So let me see if I can refresh this. There we go. We have a entry point right here. That's what I grab. Document.querySelector entry, and we are appending it here. So our entry point dot append child new dog. New dog is just our dog card with the image URL passed into it. All right. Going back over here real quick. If you're still confused by this, go ahead and let me know in Slack or in Slido. Again, you could ask maybe for more clarification. So following the logic, I can see how you need to use query selector and dog card. Where can you explain how item points to the array content? So item is just that foobar word that you use with for each or map, where you can name it whatever you want. So item could be called whatever. Item is just us going through the message. So everything in the message is now part of item here, and we're looping through all those URLs and putting them in as our parameter. So just like we did yesterday, in case that helps, where we had some data. So we had our card data, and then we used a for each, and I just put data as the kind of just something to put in there. You can name this whatever. This data is equivalent to all of the data. Where is all my data? Oh, right here. All of this data right here. It's just spitting out each individual thing. So looping through all of the data and giving us the data.title, the data.subtitle. Normally, when you're doing an API call, we only had one thing returned to us. We just had an image returned to us. So we didn't need to do like message.title, message.image, or anything like that, because we just got one thing returned to us. It was just an image. which is why we could just pass in our item, because we just want everything that we grab back, that data, to be our parameter here. Okay. Is the API in this lesson just the list of dog images? Yes. That's why we can look at some of these other APIs if you all would like. So let's look at, take a look real quick at that awesome public API or whatever, the public APIs, and let me know which one you might want to go through. Like we can go through another API, like I can make a request so that we can see the data that we're getting back. I have some other ones, but I think most of the ones I have are working with React, so don't necessarily want to do that. I can see if I have any that are not. Yeah, I think all of mine are dealing with React, so we don't want to do that, but let me know if there's one that you all want to see, and we can try to see what we can get back from a response. Just opening up some of the APIs that people are saying. Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, we could do the Studio Ghibli since, I mean, we're gonna see it with React, so we can see it with vanilla JavaScript instead. So let's see. Just want to get the URL that I need. Okay. I'm going to go back to our project here, and just for the sake of this, I'm going to, instead of putting in this, we're going to look at what the response is from Studio Ghibli. So I'm going to get rid of all of this for right now, and we just want to look at the response. So I'm going to put in Studio Ghibli, and the end URL is films. So if you wanted to look at it, you could also do that. And for this, you get lots of information back. So it's not just a URL of a picture. You get a title, you get a description, you get the director, producer. These are all things that you can now put onto cards or your screen or whatever you want to do. You can see in this case, this is doing React, but it's still just getting a response. And the response is spitting out the title, so the names, the description, the director, the release date. We're getting all that information from the API, and we're not having to like hard code all this stuff in. We're just getting that information, we're looping through it, and then we're spitting it out. So in this case, we can try to look at the response here that we'll get back from this. And then I will inspect. So once again, you go into your response and you get data. So it's often going to say something like data, and that's what you want to go into. And my data is an array, and each array is an object. So it's an array of objects that have a bunch of information in them. So they have a description, they have a director, they have an ID. If I wanted to get those things, I would do like data.description, data.director, to get all that information back. I think it's passed down. So I pass it down as like film. So I do film ID, film title, film description, film director. Again, this is React, but it's still doing the same thing. It's still a response that we're getting back. So if let me get out of some of this stuff. If I set up our card differently, so if I did something like, let's see if I could get the title instead. So here, I want to pass in title, and then I would put like title, And then going through here, instead of that, I would have to put in our title to get it. This would probably have to set it up a whole different way to get this information. But we can go through the GitHub project for the afternoon to kind of look at another response as well. I have that up too. But each time you're making a request, just to kind of just put it out there, each time you're making a request, you get a response back. And that response gives you a bunch of different kinds of data. For the dog API, it was just giving us URLs, just URLs to work with of some images. And then when we did this Studio Ghibli, we got to see, we got a lot of information. When you do the GitHub today, you're going to get a bunch of information too. And if you haven't yet, I did set up a thread for you all to put in your GitHub information. It's on Web 25. If you haven't gone through, please follow each other because you need a couple followers to go through this. There is some dummy data you can use if you don't have followers, but if you want to actually try to like make a request and get some followers, you can. You need at least, I think, 5 followers to be able to get the information. So let's bring that up. What are we doing today? So what you're going to be working with is the GitHub API. In this case, this was like grabbing my information here. So my name, it grabbed my username. It said where I'm from. It has just like a link to me. And it's, oh, my followers are messed up for some reason, but that should say the followers as well, how many people I'm following, and then what I do. So there's like a lot of information. The first time you go through, you're trying to like spit out your card. You want to see your card, and then you want to try to go through and get your followers as well. So in here, to look, because some people ask like, how are we going to set up Axios? Right here, there's a to-do. To-do, add the CDN library here. You want to add it right here. So I just added in the CDN that I mentioned, the Axios one down here. So it's got a place for you to do it. It tells you where you should put it, and you just want to add it in there. And then within your cards here, you got a bunch of steps. You're going to use an Axios to send a GET request. And then once you do that, like they're saying, hey, replace this with your name, which I did here. And then you're just going to be like doing the same thing. You're going to be creating a card. Second, inspect and study the data coming back to you. So you want to make sure you inspect the data. Don't just like go through and start trying to set a bunch of stuff up. You want to see the data that you're getting back. So the same thing we've been doing where we got a response, then we console.logged. You want to make sure you do that as well. And then there is like a followers array where you can put your followers in. I think there's like a pre-built one in here. Yeah, so there's some like instructors names from Lambda. If you don't have enough followers, you can just use some of these names in here. And you're just doing the same thing we've been doing. You're creating a component, and then you're grabbing the data and doing something with it. So you're filling in the different stuff like the source for the image, the username, you're filling it in with the data that you get back. Okay, go back to lecture here. All right, so any questions right now where we're at? We got time to answer questions, and if not, we can always do our Halloween thing a little bit early, but I wanna make sure that I get all your questions in because there's a lot here. There's a lot with promises, there's a lot with APIs, there's a lot with data. So just, give me any of your questions. Yeah, we got to add in our catch. Thank you, Jake. Good catch. Yeah, we didn't add in our .catch. We want to make sure we do that. No, so normally it's an array of objects. This is actually a very good question because I've talked to your TLs about this. I put in extra information. It's something I want you all to understand is that on the sprint challenge tomorrow, at one point, you're going to be getting an object back that you have to loop through, and looping through objects are different than looping through arrays. So in the notes, I have put a bunch of resources. So looping through objects in JavaScript, there's 3 resources here to go through when you have time. I suggest you do that because that's been a stumbling block for people on the sprint challenge. So we go through like looping through arrays in this. That was actually an array of objects is what we've been looking at. But at some point when you're going through the sprint challenge, there is an array there is an object that you're looping through, and you need to use the different methods to loop through objects. So I've talked to your TLs about it. Some of them will probably be going through that stuff with you all. But if not, definitely check out the extra resources on that. Okay, good. So Tim says complete your GitHub profile or you won't have adequate data to work with. So good tip there, Tim. Thank you for that. Are we doing, yeah, okay, we're gonna look at catch because we have not gone over that. Is response similar to item in that you can use any word? Yes, it is, but response is what you're often going to see, either response or RES. Just put that, it's like the same thing as the event object where sometimes you see it as E or sometimes you see it as event, but for consistency in the developer world, use either response or RES if you want to shorten it. That's the convention there. So answer that one. Do you put Axios get request above or below the functional component, or does it matter? It shouldn't matter where the call is coming from. I don't believe. We can test that out actually, but I don't believe it matters. You only need a couple followers. If you want everyone to follow you, you can, but you just need a few of them. Okay, let's look at a couple of the things we've asked. So some of you all have asked. Doesn't matter. I need to go back here. Okay. Does it matter if you have the Axios request before or after the functional component? So let's look. Nope, doesn't matter. So keep in mind when we were looking at that, this thing here, if you make a request, it's going to wait and all your other code is still going to execute. And this is just going to wait over here and then it's going to come in. So it doesn't matter in this case when we're doing this one, if it does or not, if it's above or below it. Okay, there was another, oh yes, the other one was, can you have the Axios call in? I don't believe you can, but let's look. So the question was, can you have the Axios call inside of the functional component? And no, because we're trying to wait for like the return and then the Axios call has to wait and this isn't going to work this way. It needs to be outside. Oops. Of this to be able to work. So again, that's one of those things, just play with and see if it works or not. It's good to ask the question though. So I think it's good for all of us to see. And then let's go ahead and look at our catch. So we didn't do a catch and what a catch is. So with a promise, when you're consuming a promise, you have a dot then, and then you have a dot catch. And the dot catch gives you an error. So it's so that you know like what's happening if you're not getting the request that you are trying to get. So sometimes like you might have an error in your URL, like you all have seen me many times, make spelling errors. If you have something like that, you want to be able to catch the error. So right below, this is just essentially just chaining this. So oops, going up here. This is our dot then, and then you would chain on the dot catch. I'm going to put it below just so that it's more readable, but it is just chaining. We're just chaining all of these. So dot get, dot then, dot catch, they're all just chained on one another. And then just like you have the response here, you have an error. Oops, error. Sometimes you'll see it as that instead, but we're going to do error. And then you just usually want to console.log the error. So I'm going to console.log. Okay, and then if you don't know, you can make your console.logs more explicit, like you can say what they are. So I'm going to put the data was not returned, and then also put error. So this is just saying what it is, and then the error. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mess up this URL right here and see if we get the error that we should be getting. So I'm going to just do that and see if we get an error when we inspect. So yeah, we get the error back, and the error back was a 404 error. So the data was not returned error. Request failed with status code 404. So it's telling us, oh, you made a mistake. You got an error. And that's what we want. So we console.logged the error, which is what this is. It actually gave us the correct error, like what the error would be. And the error was a failed with status code 404. This part right here, the data was not returned, was just that extra text that we put in there. So anytime you're working with Axios or promises, you want to do a dot then, and then you also want to do a dot catch. So thank you for catching that, because I definitely want to make sure that we go over dot catch. You want to be able to see your errors, because there can be simple things. It might not even be like a URL is messed up. It might be that when you make a request, the API, there's something wrong with the API, and you're not getting anything back, and you think you've made a mistake. So you want to be able to catch the error so that they let you know that, hey, this failed because of this reason, and it should give you an error on why it failed. Okay. GitHub rate limits. Yes, so that is a good also thing to mention. GitHub rate limits. If you make too many unauthenticated requests and all the documentation about how to authenticate or are talking about curl, is there a way to authenticate within our JavaScript? There is a way to sign up for so that you get a much higher rate limit, and I'll try to find that information for you. A lot of times the TLs will do it with the students, but let me see if I can get that information. So there is such a thing as rate limits with APIs. Not every API has it, but some of them do. So every time I've been changing my code here, I change my code, this whole thing refreshes, and it's making a call to the API. And some of them have a rate limit. So if you're constantly changing your code and you're constantly making these requests, then you're going to hit their rate limit. GitHub's, I can't remember what it is per day. I don't think it's super high unless you actually like sign up to be able to get it. So if you sign up, you can have a much higher rate limit, and you're probably not going to hit it, and it won't be a problem. But if you do hit it, sometimes that means you're cut off for a few hours. Sometimes that means you're cut off for a few days, or a day. Not usually a few days, but like a day. So what I suggest you do if you're not going to sign up for a higher rate limit is, as you're like building out your functions, as you're maybe styling, if you're styling at all, you shouldn't have to because the styles are already in there. But like while you're building this out, while you're doing other things, while you're changing your code, comment out your GET request so that you're not requesting that data. Do it the first time so that you get a response and you can see what the data looks like, and then comment it out until you're ready to display it, and only have it up when you're ready to display. Otherwise, you might hit a API limit. All right, checking Slido real quick. All right, it looks like that is all good. If you all don't have any other questions, which if you do, please give them to me because I know this is like a complicated topic. I do want to go through them if we can. But if you don't have any other questions, we can start our Halloween stuff early for today and just kind of go off that a little bit early. Once again, as far as the sprint challenge, so the sprint challenge for this week, you students aren't supposed to like fork these ahead of times, but if you want to go through and just kind of look at what they're talking about in them, you're allowed to do that. They just don't want you to fork them ahead of time and start working on them. But if you want to like look through the instructions, read the README, stuff like that, you can do that. At some point, you're going to be making requests in here for, this is called Lambda Times. It's like a newspaper thing. You're going to be making a request that comes back with an object. And so knowing how to loop through an object is going to be important for tomorrow. So definitely, once again, I'm going to say this like a couple times because it's always an issue, is please look at looping through objects. It's just different than a for each. So instead of a for each, there's a couple different ways you can do it. And so I suggest like practicing tonight at least one of these ways. There's a for in that you can use. There is an object keys that you can use. There are several other ways, but I would try to get one of those ways working today before you hit your sprint challenge tomorrow. So get some data from an object and just play around with it. I think one of the resources I gave you is actually interactive. This one, so for that one's for this one's for the objects. So I think one of these is actually interactive if you open it up and go to it. So you can try these things out. Definitely do that before tomorrow so that you're not hitting it tomorrow for the first time. So question, only when we refresh the Chrome, we ask to get from the API, right? So saying like, are we only hitting requests when we refresh? If you were to, if you're using your less compiler or you're using your different compilers or whatever is happening and you save your page, that's going to refresh like when you're working in your VS Code today. So if I were to do something and I refreshed my page at all because it's saved, then it would hit, it would make a new request. Aha, thank you, Kevin. 60 requests per hour. So definitely be conscious of that. You only get 60 requests per hour. So you want to make sure you're aware of that. So what I want to do right now, I can take more questions if you have them, but I want to start a thread of those who are going to participate. So who is participating in the Halloween? So if you're participating, go ahead and put your name in this thread so that we can get you into the form that we need to put you into so that we can judge you and see if you get the prize. So hopefully some of you are participating. So, I mean, if there's just a few, then they get a better chance of winning. So that's always good. Awesome. Got a couple people. You really do, Andrew, you really do look like Zac Efron. If you all haven't looked at his picture, he really does look like Zac Efron in this picture. So, is that what you're going as, Zac Efron? I was gonna get a white shirt and put like little black dots and be like Jim from The Office and be 3-hole punch, but I couldn't find any black dots or a white shirt, so I did not do that. All right. Just going to ask one more time. Any questions? If everyone's good, give me a thumbs up, and we'll go ahead and give everyone 10 minutes to get ready, and then we can come back and do the judging. So give me thumbs up if everyone's good. Woo, Halloween. All right, looks like we're good. I'm not getting any questions into Slido. Oh, I got one. Yay, question. Did I make a separate entry point below the error, or did you just move it? So the error didn't need an entry point. The error was, if that's what you're asking, Hunter. Let me see. Oh, I did move it because we moved some stuff around. I think I understand your question. This is the same entry point. Someone just asked if we could put the Axios call before the functional component, and that's what I did, and then I moved it back. This is the same entry point. This is just the entry point that we used for the cards. So it's not a different one. It's the same one. Yeah, good question, though. Things got moved around a lot, so. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and put a timer on for 10 minutes. Everyone can go get ready that are participating. We'll get your names in for the contest, and then we'll do the judging and see who wins. So even if you're not participating, you can stay around for seeing your fellow classmates. So it should be fun, and we'll see what everyone has as a costume. So go ahead and take 10 minutes to get ready.